Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the This.Labs podcast. Today, we are talking about all things infrastructure. And to have that conversation, I have my usual hosts. So my name is Rob Ocel. I'm a senior developer at This.Labs. Today, we have Tracy Lee, a founder at This. Tracy, how you doing?
Hello. Google I/O this week.
That's right. That's right. We also have James Spivey, a director of engineering at Shutterstock. Hey, James.
Hello.
And of course, Jarrod Overson, a director at Shape Security. Jarrod, how are you doing?
I'm doing awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay, good. So Tracy jumped a little bit ahead, but one of the things that we wanted to start with, our icebreaker for today, is broadly speaking, an interesting event or story from the last month. And to introduce this, I think one thing that somebody observed to us last year was that from January to like March, everybody just goes off the grid. You don't hear anything from anybody. It just feels like nothing happens for those 3 months. But everybody wakes up in April. That was certainly true this year. It was true for conferences. It was true for events. Just April was massive. So I'll open up the floor. Most interesting event or story from the last month since we last got together. Tracy, what is the most interesting thing that happened to you in the last month?
Well, I learned how to knit, so that's been exciting. And now I have 4 knitting needles. This is actually last week. There was NGConf last week, which was really awesome. Gosh, so many things happening this week. So NGConf was all last week. A lot of really amazing conversations. There was Angular Girls. Obviously, everyone's excited about schematics in the Angular community. Then there was GDG Summit, where all the Google Developer Group organizers got together. That was yesterday, I believe, and there was about 500 people there, so very fun. And then Women Tech Makers has a social, and it's been getting bigger and bigger every year as Google has been trying to get more women kind of like to network with each other. So did a huge event there. And then we have Google I/O this week, and so that starts today. So I don't know, Rob. I have a hard time choosing.
So you're pretty bored, is what you're saying.
Yes,
pretty bored.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How about you, James? What have you been up to? How's April been for you?
It's been good. Just staying busy, keeping the head down. I think what was exciting for me most was I was host MC at NGConf Extended here in Denver at the Breebug offices, and that was a pretty fun event. It was a chance for community to kind of get together and watch all the talks in a nice space, get some lunch, and sort of talk about all the stuff that we're seeing, and lots of cool, neat announcements. My favorite, I think, has to be StackBlitz, or StackBlitz, right? That's sending the websites to space. Yes, StackBlitz. Jogged my memory this morning, but yeah, StackBlitz sending websites to space. I think that's just too fun, and some of the ones that have been posted that are going are just really, really great. Pretty hilarious things.
Awesome. Great. And how about you, Jarrod? What have you been up to?
I've been jumping all over the place for the past month and a half. I think it started with Germany and the Kirasek Roadshow. Went to Sydney a couple weeks ago, Texas. I've been flying a lot. I'm just about gold in United, which is great. And I've got some more travel next week and the week after and the week after. So this is my calm here back at home until it starts up again. But one cool thing with all the flying and being internetless sporadically is that I've started a project to keep me occupied. And I'm finally making a video game. I got into programming 2 decades ago because I wanted to make video games. And now in my late 30s, I'm finally getting around to it.
You have awakened that itch in me too. I keep seeing your tweets about that, and I'm just like, I have to do this. Just real quickly, is there anything that you looked into to get you started on that, or is it just you're just sort of figuring it out as you go?
I mean, I've always done graphical stuff, particle systems, working a lot with Canvas, like optical illusion type things, some texture work. I've always done stuff like that, but I've never actually put it all together into a game. So it's something that I'm kind of working on experience and being around people who've done game-like things before, but I've never done anything like this from the ground up. So it's been a part of the part of the experiment is for it to be 100% TypeScript and for it to rely on 0 dependencies. So that way I don't have to worry about ever needing an NPM module if I don't have internet, and it's always going to be something I can work on whenever.
Awesome. All right. And so for me, I'm going to take this in, well, I'm going to leave it in a nerdy direction, sort of like Jarrod there, but in a non-tech direction, and say that April for me was sort of an odd month in that me, like a lot of other nerds, had to say or start saying goodbye to like favorite franchises. So no spoilers, but Avengers Endgame was last month, and Game of Thrones came back for its final season. And so I look back and I realized that the first Iron Man movie was in 2008, so that's been 11 years for Endgame, this saga, to end. Game of Thrones is 2011, so that's 8 years. And then I was like, well, I wasn't interested in anything like this long form since Lost. And I looked at Lost was 2004 to 2010. That was only 6 years. So from 2004 to like 2019, I've just had these massive, mysterious serialized story things. I don't know what's next. So if anybody's out there and has suggestions on what I should get hopelessly hooked on for the next 15 years, let me know. But it has been very emotional that all these things have been stacked in 1 month for the nerd fandom. So it's been an interesting month, to say the least. A lot of feelings. Okay, so we will jump into our topic on infrastructure, and there's a lot of various different areas that we could look at, but one of the ones that we'll jump into, because I feel like everybody talks about it all the time, is this concept of the monolith versus microservices versus serverless. And I think we've talked about this a little bit with architecture in the past, that blink and you miss it, and you think you know what you're supposed to be doing, and next year it's already changed. Does anybody want to introduce kind of what the distinction is between those various types of approaches at all? How about you, James? You want to jump in and grab at least one of those and kind of explain it?
In terms of where would you like me to even start? I feel like this is architecture of infrastructure is a vast subject. My preferences right now are in terms of Firebase as a infrastructure tool, which is one of your subject matters that we've talked about in the past, which is getting locked into something. I don't mind that as much. I think you get a good tool, you can go a long way with it. Stuff like MongoDB is great, but I like services that, you get a support structure, you get a managed service behind it with people that you can go and talk to, and that they build a community around it. I guess I don't have a great first off the bat. I have to think about this one for a moment, so I'll pass it to Jarrod.
Thank you, appreciate it. I think one of the core differences is building in support for systems that might change or disappear without notice. So in the monolithic architectures, you can reasonably rely on your code existing at any point in time. So if anything strange happens there, you might not be accustomed to handling it. But when dealing with services that are more distributed, you deal with the distribution problem, certainly, but you build in support for those connections breaking or changing over time, which has an opportunity to build more resilient systems if done properly. If done poorly, then you just have turned a big problem into a bunch of smaller problems. But I think that this also goes back to one of the things that I was talking about in one of the earlier podcasts about having very, very well-defined communication protocols that are versioned, and breaking systems down into microservices or whatever else allows you to spend more time and thought carefully crafting those communication protocols.
Well, I was wondering, so as we're sort of seeing GraphQL be kind of like the thing to do these days, I'm trying to remember if GraphQL people prefer monolithic or microservices. Do any of you know? Because I feel like whatever they prefer is going to start being the standard.
Well, GraphQL is kind of by itself already monolithic in nature, right? Because microservices are typically designed around isolating small bits of functionality into one small little thing that you can easily swap out versus at least from a high level, the theory of GraphQL of select whatever it is that you need for this particular view. So like, for example, looking at the GitHub GraphQL, it's sort of a big wide open field that you select from. So kind of by nature, it's monolithic. What do you think, Rob?
I'm speaking a little out of my depth here. So my thought is that that would be interesting is my understanding of GraphQL, and I'm happy to be wrong about this, is that effectively you're kind of putting a front on top of your existing backend architecture, and that it would be reasonable, or at least seemingly feasible, for you to have a distributed backend, right? That all these microservices acting. If you sent some sort of query that required data from multiple microservices, that theoretically your sort of GraphQL engine or whatever that you're running, that your adapters that you created could kind of make those calls for you. Now, I don't know, that introduces all sorts of questions about performance and whether that's a performant query to make or how you manage those kind of problems. But I actually don't know if they would have a strong preference. I would be very surprised if GraphQL had the kind of momentum that it has now, but somehow had an implicit requirement that you were using a monolith system or a near monolith system, because I feel like it is a 4-letter word now, monolith.
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily, it's fun, we actually had like a lot of discussions around monoliths and microservices at the last GraphQL contributor days, because I think this is a problem that a lot of people are dealing with. And I wish I could speak a little bit more eloquently about this specific topic, but it actually quite intrigued me, right? Because, again, like kind of like as we're seeing GraphQL be implemented, is that really going to start shaping how people feel? Like, it's kind of like when Angular, for example, was, what was it? Not monolith. What is the thing called? Monorepo. Like, it was like, no monorepo. And then all of a sudden, everybody's like, just kidding. It's totally better to do monorepo right now. And you kind of see everybody in the Angular community moving forward to that. Is the same thing going to happen kind of like as these new technologies get implemented?
I think that's actually a really good point in terms of where we're going. One of the things that from an infrastructure standpoint, and this goes back to sort of just a moment ago, is NoSQL is really becoming a big thing. Like, we're starting to see the adoption of tools that put a NoSQL front forward. So whether it be GraphQL, which obviously can still run SQL queries behind, but from a front end perspective, all they get is, I want this thing and I get it back. Firebase is the same way, right? They started primarily as a NoSQL data store, and basically it was just querying this large JSON document, sort of however you needed it, slicing and dicing. And that, while it does scale decently well, it's not extremely scalable, which is what they went to. So now they've got their Firestore. And that is very much in the same NoSQL vein, where you can sort of select wherever you want from and get the references to things and cross-cut the data you need, not necessarily in the same format that like a GraphQL approach does, which is building an actual data object as you would like it. These NoSQLs are still a very structured data format, but it is still getting away from, here's my V2 API at this one endpoint, and you can only get back these things. And if you want to modify that or get something else, you got to go to the backend tier, or be it Java or Node or whatever, reslice it, do whatever, and then update everything. It's still that faster iterative process of developing the ability to get data to a front end, which I think is where a lot of this stuff is really trying hard to go to.
Yeah, that's good. I want to pull us slightly back to the microservices and serverless portion of this, and then we can come back to the relational NoSQL piece, because I think that's a big topic for us to tackle as well. But one of the things that I've done in the past is worked with a client to take a monolithic backend structure and break it up into microservices. And one of the things that's underappreciated is the degree to which going from a monolithic design to a microservice or a serverless design is not just a change in how you break up your applications, but it's a totally different programming mindset. And I equate it a little bit to people that used to do object-oriented like imperative programming with objects, and they would call it object oriented just because eventually they had to new a class, even though the classes were like completely had nothing to do with anything. So like what I've seen is as we started to rip the monolith apart, we realized how many times we had violated some of the dependencies between objects, and they would like you'd have this flow where this thing would call out to another piece of code and it would get something back, and then it would call it to another piece of code and get back, and all this back and forth ping ponging. And as soon as you fractured the monolith, suddenly all those became server calls instead of memory calls, and the app just went absolutely into the mud. So I don't know, have you guys experienced this or have any other stories of making this transition, or how to get yourself into the mindset of a microservice programmer or a serverless programmer?
I mean, this ties in very well to the topic that Tracy brought up, monorepos versus a bunch of individual repos, or I guess one monolithic code repository, not necessarily split up into multiple versus a bunch of different, like let's say NPM modules or something like that. It's very difficult to start breaking up code into even just smaller bits of code once you start to realize that you've broken all those good practices that you're supposed to be following for all that time. And that's a very, very that's a very, very difficult thing to go through, whether or not it's breaking a monolith and a microservices, a giant repository, and a bunch of smaller modules. I don't know if there's a substantial amount of prep that you can give to somebody that would get them ready for that until they've started to see the implications of some decisions down the line. I think as with any sort of major refactoring like this, certainly having a solid foundation of tests will make it easier to verify that what you've done is what is still doing the same thing that you wanted to do earlier. But that's often not the case when you're tasked with breaking apart a giant monolith into microservices.
Yeah.
There's a tool I used to use I really like for that. I haven't used it lately, but I know it's still heavily supported, called Hipster. I don't know if you guys have heard of that at all. It's a very popular sort of generational CLI you can build microservices from, and also it'll help create sort of your interactions between your front end. So it'll create an Angular app for you out of that'll give you the basics of your CRUD. I used it a lot back in the day just for some sort of quick startup ideas, and back before it had become microservices sort of become a thing, and so it started as this large monolithic API. And then as that tool evolved, I would play with it more and then started restructuring things into microservices. And as you said, it's a very different way of thinking, but there are tools that can help you do that, like Hipster, that I think are really useful for it.
For sure. And I think when you're breaking your monolith up, it could be tempting, especially if you have a really heavily data-based app or something that has a lot of endpoints based on your models, to just take every like /people/addresses, and those just become the people service and the address service. And sometimes that can be really tempting to do. But I've seen similar mistakes in front-end applications where people take their UI, like the picture that their person gave them of the UI, and just every time they can draw a box that excludes one piece of the drawing, they just call that a different component. And that's usually not the best way to break things down. It usually doesn't create interesting code reuse. And so sometimes when you have that monolith and you break it into the microservices based just on switching out the routes, this route goes to this service now, and this route goes to this service, you can end up in those situations where you have to do a lot of talk over the wire. So it's useful for people that are thinking about doing that decomposition, that breakup, to map the dependencies and the calls on some of your like biggest routes and figure out which of the things that you're proposing or services actually heavily rely on each other. And if you draw that graph, sometimes you might see that like, oh, this thing that we were going to make a service, and this thing that we were going to make a service, and this other thing we were going to make a service, those three things are heavily dependent on each other. They frequently call each other. Let's just make those one service. Now, maybe you're one step towards making it back into a monolith, but at least when you're making the refactoring, that'll not hurt the performance as bad. Okay. Let's jump back to the topic of the databases, because that's another interesting one, the sort of the relational and the NoSQL databases. James, you were kind of introducing this idea that the NoSQL database concept is like the products that are on offer right now are kind of gaining popularity, gaining steam. Did you want to go into that a little bit more and kind of explain what that offering is, maybe why people are, find it so appealing?
Sure. Yeah, I got introduced to it by another startup. It's been a while now. They had run their startup, very minimal people. I think they only had 3 full-time devs, and they had built the entire front end and all of the services that communicated with this tool that they were building, and it allowed them to rapidly iterate, prototype, and build this whole system that could scale itself horizontally with no DevOps team. And I think that's a really, really compelling argument for small startups or POC ideas, whatever it might be. It's a really great way for optimal use of your resources when we're already used to transferring JSON back and forth. It's just kind of what we've been doing for a long time. So the ability to not have to think about all the process that goes into putting together a server farm or whatever DNS settings, this, that, the other thing. It's just, here's this thing, here's some security rules to make sure it's still secure the way I need to, as I would with any other server. And then I can just transmit data the way I would like to. Now it opens a lot of other doors that become more difficult. The ability to remap data if you've got to restructure your database, some of the performance hits that can come when you start to get a large volume of records. A monolithic JSON document does not scale very well. That's not to say that you can't use it for other things. I've seen a lot of scenarios now that Firestore is around, where they're using that document store to store documents because of its ability to scale so well, and then using Firebase, just their old standard system, to do like configs and smaller things that don't have millions of records. It's a very compelling way to get an idea from its infancy up into a real working product that you can ship at a production scale. Maybe it doesn't last at true enterprise scale. Maybe it does. I know a lot of enterprises are using Firebase, so it's very, very possible. But I think that's just really compelling in terms of optimal use of resources.
Based on everybody's experience, is there certain types of data that fit better in a relational model or fit better for the NoSQL model? Or do you think that it's becoming the case that these products, the NoSQL products in particular, are advancing far enough that maybe some of those things that we're distinguishing before aren't as big? Like one of the big things I know everybody talks about, sort of the ACID properties, right? Atomicity, consistency, isolation, durability. These are the hallmarks of all relational systems. And for a while, a lot of the NoSQL the NoSQL offerings essentially relax one or more of those original paradigms in order for greater gains. When you're choosing between one of those systems, should you think about what your data is like, or is it becoming the case that now these two sort of strategies are close enough that it doesn't matter anymore?
Well, that's a good question. I think I'd have to leave that more towards James. I think my experience with NoSQL caps out at Redis about 5 or 6 years ago, when Redis was certainly very early and did not have an incredibly full feature set. It was still very fast, but the NoSQL patterns were still evolving, and the support for things that you would expect out of a database system were not there. So we had to build a lot of those ourselves, which caused a lot of strain and development on things that really weren't core to the business. And I was soured on it for a little bit, and kind of went back to relational databases. I think now both relational databases like Postgres and the newer wave of NoSQL databases have certainly made vast improvements in user experience and developer experience. So I think that the feature set has certainly that the gap has decreased over time. But I have not played around with Redis recently and don't know exactly what it offers. James, do you have any ideas?
I think the biggest thing to be aware of when making these choices, there's sort of two complexities that come with NoSQL that a standard relational database still just to this day is far superior, which is relational data. When you have actual data in different sections of your store that relate to each other, there is a real cost from processing and network to recombine those for a UI that might need them to be combined. That needs to be accounted for when you're looking at what you're building. You know, small things can be fine, but as the complexity of what you're trying to display or work with grows, there is very real cost to updating all these different references that you have and making sure that all of those succeed in a transactional nature versus something like a standard microservice with a relational database backend where it's just push the thing and it saves, or maybe GraphQL where it's the object model that you requested, you're getting and you're sending that back, and then the behind the scenes curtain part of GraphQL updates appropriately where it needs to. So there's very real cost to that you need to consider when looking at what my screens look like, what my data model looks like. It can be very, very valuable for the more standard CRUD stuff that is not super relational if your data is structured that way. I think that's the biggest thing to sort of be aware of. And then the other real complexity that you tend to get as a complaint around NoSQL is the ability to write complex queries. It's pretty simple if you're just wanting to look for a particular type of ID or one smaller bit of thing. You know, Firebase did not have a great tool set for doing filtering. You sort of brought everything down onto the client and then you filtered, and that wasn't great. Firestore's done a lot better. The complexity of the queries that you can derive out of it are far improved. You can definitely do a lot more things, but I still don't think it's quite to the same scale in terms of certain things that we want to do in a relational database that are often very trivial or at least mundane to do in those types of scenarios. So knowing what that complexity look like ahead of time before you pick these tools, or at least have a general idea, is very useful when you're looking at like, what's my infrastructure going to look like? And I think the last point to that that's really important, they're also not mutually exclusive, right? You can have a little bit of data over here, a little bit of data over there. You can have some stuff in a relational database. And there is all of these tools, whether it be Microsoft or Google, pretty much any of the major players, offers ways to translate between the two. So I've actually done, I worked with a startup where we built a NoSQL database that held a large, vast array of information, but it needed to go to the standard relational database every night, sort of in a queued process to do some things and then come back. So we had a fairly trivial node script that basically, cron jobbed every night the latest batches, pushed it, processed it, did the things it needed to do in this traditional database, and then brought it all back. So they very much can still be interoperable together. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I know, like, for anybody that's listening that's not familiar with these NoSQL products, right? Like, one of the things that differentiates them is that you can put these collections of information together that don't necessarily have to have a cohesive schema, right? So the relational model, you have to define, this is a collection of things that all look like this, right? And then the other version, you just have these documents, or they could be JSON objects, or they could be whatever, however they choose to represent the information. The ways that you get data out of the relational databases is usually using SQL, right? The language, and that's why the other alternative is NoSQL. But these solutions, the NoSQL solutions, have this really powerful MapReduce function. I remember I heard MapReduce in the context of big data, and I just thought it was this like impenetrable concept until I actually like dealt with getting data out of these systems. And realistically, all it is MapReduce is you have no index. Well, okay, that depends on the product you have, but generally speaking, you don't have strong indices in your collections in your NoSQL stores. So one of the things that you do is you have to go to every document, do a map operation, which is becoming more popular in JavaScript, so more people are familiar with it. But you pull out certain pieces of data about it. Then once you've gotten that data out of every document, you take all that pieces of information and you start to combine them together to get the result that you want out. And having experience, now I would not advise this, but having experience being forced to use a NoSQL database to implement a heavily relational data model, you can do some powerful things with MapReduce and creating temporary tables, temporary collections that are based off of the map or reduce of other collections that can get around a lot of these limitations. But you start to struggle with this concept of eventual consistency, which is to say that two people that make reads to the same value won't necessarily get the same answer back if it was recently edited, because it just takes time sometimes in these systems to distribute that new answer throughout the entire distributed system, right? This is generally something that isn't a problem with relational databases, that is more a problem with NoSQL databases. So what I started to think was, if you have data that is edited constantly, like if you're constantly revising the same records over and over and over and over again, maybe NoSQL isn't what you're trying to look for that piece of data, as James was saying. There might be other pieces of data that you could. But like, if you have a very create new documents and then you just read documents a lot, I think that's a pretty good approach. I don't know. Do you guys have is there any other advice that people should know if they're trying to think should I be using, Mongo or Postgres or these types of things? If they're sitting down and they're about to come up with the data model or the data store for their greenfield application, their greenfield project, do you guys have any other last tips for them?
The thing that took me the longest to figure out when I first went to a NoSQL approach was I had always been a Postgres and traditional data store. I had a very structured way in my head of how data should look. And when I started working with NoSQL, it's a very different way of thinking about how your data is stored and what it looks like. It's very much encouraged to be far flatter than you would normally look at how your data is structured. And so wrapping your head around that really helped you start to see where certain types of data were better to be flattened out and would work great in that scenario versus others where you're like, this doesn't make any sense like this. And that was a big mindset shift that helped me a lot. Firebase provided really good guides on how to do that. And I keep coming back to them just because that's what I have the most experience with. There are plenty of other, Microsoft's got their product. Amazon's got theirs. There's lots of options. You can just go the open source route, but there are lots of great guides on how to think in a new NoSQL format. And I highly recommend that if you're considering going the NoSQL route, is read those data guides first, because they will help you look at your data in your own context and really judge for yourself whether that's the correct approach for your particular needs or whether you should stick with the standard Postgres approach. But those were a big mind shift for me that helped a lot in that process.
Great. Let's pivot over and talk about another interesting topic with infrastructure is the IaaS, right? The infrastructure as a service, which kind of has different flavors nowadays, right? So some people might be really big on the AWS versus Google versus Azure versus whomever else, the sort of cloud piece of this. But then there's also just the deployment piece of this, right? You have your Zeitz and Firebase and Heroku and all these other companies that are kind of making it easy to deploy. I mean, for the dinosaurs that are out there, like the age of having to get a crappy web hosting thing and use their web-based FTP platform to get a zip file uploaded and extracted to get your website deployed is long gone. I mean, I guess first, just does anybody want to talk about how sort of awesome these products are that we have these now?
Yeah, and I've kind of did a huge flip recently with the past year and a half of advances in cloud services, where now I fully support basically anything that can do what you want right now, just to get something up and started in order to prove concepts, in order to prove viability, and then assess the appropriateness of the platform after the fact. And it's just so incredible how quickly you can get things up and running, and with such cheap cost that thinking about how to do it differently is, in my opinion, just wasted thought right now. Deal with those discussions after you've proven that the current strategy has viability, and then adjust the strategy afterward. But it's really incredible how quickly you can get incredibly scalable solutions up there so easily right now.
Fail fast, learn even faster. That's a motto I try to live by when it comes to software. And I agree. I remember when AWS first came out with Beanstalk, and I thought that was just the coolest thing. All I had to do was select this WAR file and hit upload, and then suddenly I had a fully CDN'd, ready to go hosted site that was up and running. And I just thought that was just the coolest thing. And now stuff, it continues to blow my mind how easy Firebase hosting is. You can go in, you can put a custom domain name, and you've got an SSL certificate. the whole thing up and running in less than 20 minutes. And then you can just keep hitting publish, and you've got brand new site up there immediately. And if something goes wrong, you can even roll it backwards, and that's to a global CDN. I mean, that is just mind-boggling from where it used to be, like you said, with uploading through an FTP. It's impressive what it's done. And we know it works at scale. I think Tracy could speak to this with the Rxjs Docs. I believe those are on Firebase, correct? On Firebase hosting?
Yes, they are.
Yep. So
yes.
We're looking at a major product with people that visit, these docs frequently, and it's always performant, it's always available. All the site looks great, and it's easy. I hope it's easy for them. You can speak to it more than myself because I haven't been involved in that. But I just think that's a real testament to where we've come in terms of this infrastructure as a service concept.
So Jarrod, I'm really curious. Oh, I'm sorry, Trace, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say it's been really interesting to kind of see. Well, as I'm listening to you guys have all these discussions about different things, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what do I need to know as, a beginner developer? Like, where do I need to get started? What should I use? And obviously, like James, I would pull, I love, Heroku, I love Firebase, but then we're looking at things like Netlify is a very popular one right now as well.
Great tool.
And, where do I get started? What do I do? How, what do you guys think?
I don't think you go wrong with any of them. I think as a beginner, I think that's what's great about these infrastructure as a service products, like we've talked about with how easy they are, is it enables me as a beginner, if I don't have a ton of experience, to, with a little bit of trial and error, be able to go and prove out an idea or a concept I had, or play with something and try something new. I think it's always empowering when you're first getting started to see something that you are trying to understand and then have it suddenly start working and pop. That's always such an amazing feeling. And so I'm going to build a spa with React or with Angular, and it's going to be a small calculator or a hello world or a log of my dog, like something really fun that I have in my head, to then be able to put all that together, build it out, publish it to the web, and then have it so I can send it to anyone in the world and have it work. I think that's really exciting. And so just looking for those tools that can help you do that on any of the products that offer, a generous free starter, Netlify, Firebase, Microsoft, they all offer very generous limits so you can have these ideas and share them with the world. Just find one that works for you, that you can kind of make sense of, that has rules that are good guides, a good community around it that can sort of help you and lean into it a little bit. I'm wearing this shirt because I knew we were talking about infrastructure. This is a site called Angular Firebase. He's now fireship.io. And he's a great resource. Jeff Delaney has helped me a bunch. His ability to help you gauge and learn about some of these things from an intro's perspective to build out some of these ideas. I've liked that as a community. It's why I like Angular, because Angular is so vested in that community. And I think that's why I like Firebase too, because they've put a lot of effort into building a community around their product to get people to go. And I've definitely got my eye on Microsoft right now, because they're doing very much the same of building a community around their products, getting people like John Papa out there talking about how easy it is to deploy Azure functions and things like that, and Azure hosting, and just show how simple and easy it is to help you get that idea off the ground.
What about this whole deploying to the edge thing? Do all of these infrastructure as a service things allow us to deploy to the edge?
Not really. That's a very different subject in terms of getting started. In terms of distribution, right? Google, AWS, Microsoft, they've got nodes all over the place. So you can get your idea out to these global, areas. When you start really talking about edge, like Akamai, that's a very different concept, right? That's generally speaking, serving static files, static web pages with no real dynamicism, ideally out to the edge. And that's, through thousands and thousands and thousands of these edge servers. But it's a very, very different thing. And it's a problem I've been dealing with a lot with dynamicism at the edge. Oof, cannot speak today.
Would it be like, do you think that like any of these companies are going to start allowing you to do that just by default maybe, or even have, I just feel like it's such, like, speaking of conferences, Microsoft Build is this week as well. So that's exciting. But I think, Rob, you and I have had a lot of conversations with people in the past year just about edge.
Well,
And I've been recently having some conversations about people building things where they're going to allow people to deploy to the edge, very much like Netlify or something like that. But
yeah,
maybe
I think
it's
what's interesting about this is, so we started, right? So if we take it full circle, we started with the monolithic server that was in your server rack in your office. Then AWS came around, or I don't know the exact timeline, but we moved our monolithic servers out of our back office into the cloud. We thought, awesome, now it's not co-located with us, and we can put multiple copies of that monolith around the world. Then we said, well, let's splinter that into these microservices. And then some people said, even more so, let's just take the code out of the microservice and just have it run serverless, right? So now I think I just saw, I'm not super in depth on how it's working out, and James, you can say if you've looked into it, but Cloudflare is talking about having edge workers running now. So instead of just having static CDN content, they'll like essentially cache your serverless functions on the edge.
Well, I think they already have it.
Yeah, they have that.
They already have it. Yeah.
AWS has it. They have it's called Lambda at Edge.
Okay.
So Lambda, yeah, the serverless approach I think is a brilliant one as a model in general. It saves us all costs of not paying to run a node server when it's not running. You know, like keeping it running when we don't need to. You know, we've got the issues of cold starts, whatever. But the concept of doing dynamicism at edge is really around these sort of lightweight serverless, serverless functions that operate closer to the end users. But the problem is that they're extremely limited in their power. So we have to be very difficult with what we run at the edge for these types of, functions, whatever they be, Lambda at edge or workers at edge. They have to be very limited in what they do. And so finding that balance of trying to solve those problems versus just keeping it all running at your server and having the latency of the communication between them.
Yeah, I think Cloudflare and Akamai were good names to bring up because I think that the only way that CDNs survive over the course of the next 5 years is by becoming more of a cloud service that allows you to take control of different parts of their infrastructure, essentially. Because the only real value to a CDN for the past 20 years has been just they have computers all around the world so they can send things closer when they need to. And then now with cloud services like AWS, GCP, Azure, and others out there, like that is no longer a core selling point. And especially as you start to spread out the decision-making of what happens at the edge to essentially those same places that CDNs were living, the only way for CDNs to survive is to become more of like a cloud computing platform, like with edge workers or whatever else. But I think that in general, that's certainly where things are being pushed. And the cloud services that are leading the way right now are very likely going to be more aggressive in that pushing over the course of the next 2 to 4 years. So if it were me and I had to make a choice, I would invest more heavily on assuming that was going to be a more viable likelihood than erring on the side of caution there.
And we should caveat that there will never not be a need to serve things like images and video at the edge that will stay completely flat and just keeping those heavy items as far out and as close to your customers as possible. So we'll never be able to actually remove that need, which is I think where CDNs will continue to keep their bread and butter, like Akamai. I know that they get a fair amount from video and photos at the edge, but I absolutely agree with you, Jarrod, that we're going to start seeing more and more of this move closer and closer to our customers, because customers are getting smarter and smarter about what to demand and what to expect. And the site that's performant and has great accessibility and can load, as a PWA, and all of that in less than a second, right on my cell phone on a 3G at the edge. Like, that's starting to become the new norm now. And so we all have to start thinking about how do we tackle that problem.
Awesome. Jarrod, I had one question for you, which is sort of related to what we've been talking about. But as people look to putting their content and using these different providers, either the deployment providers or the cloud service providers, one thing that people might struggle with is sort of this optimization about security, right? And they might be doing these concerns. One side says, don't build stuff that already exists, right? Don't roll your own, because you're never going to be as smart as the experts, right? But the other might say, well, yeah, but if we all use AWS, then the hackers or the adverse agents just have to attack AWS. They don't have to know what we're doing. They just have to know how to beat that, and then they get all of us, right? Like, what are the security implications of this sort of environment? What should people be thinking about or just not worrying about as it pertains to security?
I think there's a lot of topic there. I think the one you were tackling, I think there's so much greater chance of disaster occurring if you try to take all that on yourself. I mean, it's like having to patch all your servers and all your hardware when some vulnerability comes out, and you're already your team is already overworked. You don't have time. You've got deadlines. I mean, the security is the first thing to go there. So a larger company who has made guarantees about their security posture, I would trust more just in general. But I think that the bigger implication of security comes from the discussion we're talking about the edge. Because like one of the things that we at Shape Security do is we block bad traffic from exploiting your site. So now if you were to do that yourself, that traffic has to get all the way into your origin. Your origin server needs to make some decision about that and then decide that you don't want to serve this content, or you want to block it or do whatever else. That sort of decision would save so much cost and bandwidth and processing if it were done at the edge. If you know that there's a request that should not be making its way all the way into your systems, then you just kill it at the start, and then everyone's happier all the way around. So when it comes to security and protecting sites and applications that way, I see that pushing way further out to the edge, as opposed to tying all these routes and networks together in order to make these decisions, or embedding it into microservices or monoliths.
Awesome. Perfectly stated. And this has been such a great conversation. It's moved so quickly that we've found ourselves already out of time. So we'll have to put this down for now and pick it back up. A lot of interesting topics still on the table for the future. And then that's the way we like it. Keep the conversation going. So one of the things that we like to do as we close each of these podcasts is sort of celebrate something about this.labs which we really like. And one of the things that we really enjoy doing at this.labs is community building. So we fund and organize and support a lot of different meetups and different conferences. And there's just amazing people in all the different communities around the country and around the world doing stuff in that area. So what I wanted to close with is sort of saying, are there any community conferences, meetups, or events coming up this year or coming up soon that you guys are super excited about? And I'll start. And one of the things that I really wanted to point out and just say is really awesome are the collection of women's organizations in a lot of these major frameworks. So ViewConf US was recent, and they had a giant Vue Vixen skulk there. So a lot of really cool events for the Vue Vixens. The Rxjs girls just had a conference or a meetup or something like that in London, I think it was, that Dan Abramov said was just raving about. And just the talks were phenomenal coming out of that. And Tracy and I are actually going to go to an NG Girls workshop in Kansas City in July, which we're super excited to go to and mentor and just help out and support those communities. So, that's something that we're really looking forward to, is just the continued proliferation of these sort of, organizations and conferences and meetups that are just supporting women in the tech industry. How about Tracy? What do you got next?
Well, I will be keynoting Refactor Tech, which is a conference in Atlanta focused on diversity and inclusion and tech. So that'll be great. Rob and I will also be speaking there about inclusive architecture. So excited. And then Angular Girls as well. Rob and I will both be going to Angular Girls Kansas City to mentor a bunch of folks there. And yeah, it'll be my first full one. I've always dropped in, but I've never been an official mentor. So I'm excited.
That's great. How about you, Jarrod?
Local here, I'm restarting the Node.js meetup group. So our first re-kickoff meeting is on Thursday. I'll be talking about GCP and Node.js on Google Cloud Functions. Outside of that, I've got a bunch of...
In the triangle.
Yes, in the research triangle.
Yeah.
I'm speaking at KakalakiCon and Amsterdam JS Nation on the event stream NPM exploited package from last November. So going through the how it was exploited, how it happened, what it did, how to protect yourself from it, and a bunch of other scary gloom and doom things. And then QCon New York, talking about credential stuffing and imitation attacks. So I've got a big couple months coming up.
Great. And James?
I don't have nearly as much excitement going on as you all. That sounds like a lot of fun. I might have to tag along in somebody's suitcase here, but the one I'm excited for is going to be Angular Denver, the second year Angular conference. Much bigger this year. A lot of great speakers. Some of my good friends from the community are all going to be there. I'm going to be there. So I'm really looking forward to that conference. Might possibly be speaking. We'll see. But I'm looking forward to that one. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And I think everyone always really enjoys it. We got a lot of great feedback about it last year. And then just, our local community around here is always exciting to me. I co-host the Rocky Mountain Angular, and I really love all the talks that we have. So if there's anyone out watching, please reach out to me. We'd love to get some additional speakers, some first-time speakers, some women speakers, underrepresented minority speakers, anyone. We'd love to have you. So yeah, that's it for me.
Awesome. Yes, 100%. Support your local meetups, support your local conferences. They are diamonds in the rough if you happen to be around things like that. And if you're curious, if you're in any part of the country or around the world where you feel like there isn't anything near you as far as meetups and conferences, reach out to us. Because Tracy has compiled a pretty large list about meetups and things like that. And we can happily point you in the direction of people that are hosting things near you, or get you hooked up with some help on how to start setting stuff up yourself.
We also have Modern Web Online, which is it next week? I think it might actually be next week. No, it's in 2 weeks. So we have Modern Web Online in 2 weeks, and we'll have 3 speakers. And one will be about GraphQL, one will be about accessibility, and one will be about edge cases and what we should be doing with edge cases, because we all know that we love to talk about edge cases and all that other stuff. So I think those will be really interesting conversations. We've also been talking about potentially doing like Angular Online, React Online, Vue Online type topics, which reminds me, let's go buy those domain names. Can I buy those domain names?
Better do it before before too many people watch this.
I know.
Okay, get that
Don't beat me, everyone. Yes.
All right. Yeah, that event's on May 22nd. So depending on when you're listening to this or watching this, it's either in the future or perhaps in the past. And if it's in the past, it's probably on this YouTube channel, and you can just watch, or on the Modern Web YouTube channel, and you can find a replay of that.
But we do this consistently, so you can always look forward to that.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us on this podcast about infrastructure. And thank you to all of my co-hosts. So Tracy Lee, you can find her online at Lady Leet. James Spivey, you can find him online at MySpivey. So that's MySpivey. And Jarrod Overson, you can find him online at JS Overson. So JSOVERSON. And my name is Rob Ocel, and you can find me online at Rob Ocel. So it's ROBOCELL. And that's it. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, hosts, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
All right.